Sometimes at the Taxpayers Union we're accused of being a bit too negative on the government, but today we have a bit of a cheery update. We've asked Simon Court, the Parliamentary Under-Secretary to the Minister of Resource Management Act replacement or Resource Management Reform, and it's an important job because the Resource Management Act is by far the biggest regulatory tax facing New Zealand. In fact, the survey of our business members is that along with MMP, it is either the first or the second biggest handbrake on New Zealand's long-term productivity. It is also, in living standards, it is obviously too the big driver behind our housing affordability crisis. And I would certainly argue, Simon, our housing crisis and problems around planning represents an existential threat to the centre-right, particularly if you look towards Britain, which is perhaps the future of the centre-right, where the Tories' average age was 63 this election. Pricing my generation out of the housing market means that conveyor belt of people becoming more conservative or more to the centre-right as they age stops. So, an important task. Got you in here today because obviously ACT seem a little bit copper hoot over the weekend about the announcements on Friday. But before we go there, what is a Parliamentary Under-Secretary?
Well, Parliamentary Under-Secretary is probably the best role for somebody who's interested in better public policy, but doesn't want to get phone calls in the night saying, Minister, the kids are on the roof again. What's it going to be, KFC and McDonald's? The answer for me would be bread and water, but I'm not going to get those calls. My role is exclusively around developing better public policy. It's around replacing the Resource Management Act. It's national policy direction for infrastructure and for offshore wind. And I also have another role for Minister Bishop, which is to develop the policy updates for infrastructure funding and financing, including the public-private partnership model, which has been kind of run down by many on the left when it comes to projects like Transmission Gully. But guess what? It didn't go anywhere near as over budget as some government projects where you had officials in charge. And everyone who's driving on it will tell you it's the best thing that's happened to Wellington in their lifetime.
So let's stick to the, as much as I love talking roads, and this government seems to love talking roads, I don't know how many times Simeon Brown can roll out a pothole task force over and over and over again. And get
well, apparently he's on it now. I've seen him out there on TikTok.
But let's get back to, so this is the role that David Seymour had in the key government with Heke Parada and got through charter schools. So you have the policy pen, or you help develop policy but don't speak for the government and you're not part of the executive?
So I started developing this policy in 2022. That was when ACT put together our proposal for building New Zealand and conserving nature, an alternative to the Resource Management Act and the planning system we've currently got. I interviewed over 40 stakeholders, including federated farmers, of course, lots of infrastructure and planning consultants, and even environmental scientists who are really keen to see the amount of nutrients discharged into the environment reduced in places where they are over-allocated. And through that process, I developed ACT's proposals, which we campaigned on. What we got during the coalition negotiation was an agreement to replace the Resource Management Act with a system based on property rights, and then fleshing out the detail of that has been left to me and some other policy experts, which we have then, with Chris Bishop's sponsorship, taken through Cabinet and had approved for release last Friday, a system to replace the RMA with a new system based on property rights.
So we sent that announcement on to what we call our Taxpayer Caucus, and it looked quite good. I've subsequently read, of course, the speech, the weird sort of yin and yang speech you did with Christopher Bishop. I've never seen a ministerial speech where you sort of have two politicians doing a couple of paragraphs each and then swapping round. But take me through, what have you managed to get through Cabinet? And there was reference to these 10 principles.
Well, just firstly on the speech, Bishop and I are very closely aligned on what we want to achieve, and that was actually very well received by the audience. It showed that we are aligned in what we want to achieve.
This was to the Resource Management Practitioners Conference. That sounds about as fun as LGNZ.
Well, actually, quite a lot more fun, because they actually want to get on and build things for their clients. Whereas you go to LG...
No trans rock, paper, scissors?
Absolutely not.
Okay, all right.
Although there are some there who are a little bit obsessed with concepts of co-governance and partnership and spiritual matters around water.
Yes.
But I didn't have to attend any of those sessions because I was...
Well, we'll come back to those.
So just come back to the principles. So we want to narrow the scope of resource management to only effects on the environment. So at the moment, the current resource management system could describe something you want to do to your house that might have effects on heritage. If local council has painted a heritage overlay over your street and you want to do a renovation, even something like putting in a wheelchair ramp or improving the steps so that elderly people can get up there safely, you'd have to get a resource consent. You might not be able to do it. But there's no real effect on the environment caused by heritage. Heritage is a private value. So we just want to narrow it right down.
And it's sort of all preferences stuff. I mean, we get a lot of feedback from our supporters around council saying, no, that wall shouldn't be concrete, that should be wood because that would look better and things like that. This cuts all of that out, does it? Yeah, absolutely. And we have lots of examples that I've collected about just that kind of problem. The regional council thinks that it's not nice to look at a concrete block wall, so they've asked infrastructure provider to clad it with an aluminium sandwich panel. There's no designer in the world who's ever had to stick an aluminium panel on the side of a concrete block wall. So when commissioners and councils are asking for this kind of thing, they're imposing massive costs, but also risk on builders and constructors, in the building and the long-term operation of assets. So we want to get right away from that. What's really important is that we do protect people's property rights. We don't want to end up in a situation where people are built out, have their sunlight taken through overshadowing. This is the Epsom fudge.
Well, if we think about
we believe in freedom, except if it's going to affect your view or sunlight in Epsom.
Well, we've been very clear what we're trying to do. It's to replace the system with a system based on enjoyment of property rights. That means I should be able to enjoy my property knowing what the rules are for the property next door and for my own, and that if somebody wants to exceed those rules, they're still going to have to go and apply they're still going to have to get their neighbours' permission, and if that's not granted, we've got a pathway for development to proceed.
But can you contract, because the rational thing and what the RMA totally abandoned was the ability to come to agreements with your neighbours and enforce them.
Well, that's going to be the first stage. So we think that contracting between neighbours is the best way to manage the kind of effects that you might have on someone else's property if you want to build higher than the zones allow. And that once you've made that agreement, that could go on a property file, and that's enduring, so that the next person who comes along can't object to something you've built or intend to build.
Like a caveat type arrangement.
Yeah, indeed. And that where there are disputes between neighbours or disputes between individuals, property owners and council who might say, we want you to, we insist you apply for various consents. We're actually proposing a disputes tribunal type operation. It's not an environment court, it's not your local council, where you can go and get a quick determination. Like, do I actually need a consent for this? Hey, my neighbour won't agree, but I'm pretty sure that we're allowed to do this.
How do you stop that being taken over by the, I was going to say by the zealots, but you've got a whole industry of, to be generous, of a generation of experts that have grown up playing SimCity and frankly like to boss people around. That's what planning is.
Yeah. So the objective of the legislation and its purpose clause are going to be absolutely vital. That's why we focus on enjoyment of property rights and limiting this concept of effects to, in the urban context, to effects on amenity. So there will be a little bit of judgment involved, but it's going to be far more enabling. And there's a number of ways that we can make it enabling. We want to separate the current resource management system in two. The current Resource Management Act talks about integrated resource management, where you integrate land use planning.
When you say we, you mean Act, or this is speaking for the government?
So what we announced, one of the principles that we've adopted is we want to, instead of having one Act, one Resource Management Act, we're going to have two. And so that would be one Act to manage the built environment and infrastructure, and another to manage the effects on, say, water quality, for example. Because at the moment, they're all mixed up. So that any objection on one grounds can lead to a whole range of consents for things that actually aren't effects on the environment. So we think that by having two acts, it will solve the problem that the RMA caused, which is this concept of integrated resource management. Back in the 90s, it was popular to talk about sustainable development goals and all of these things, and the RMA was an expression of those back in 1991. It's not possible. You can't say on the one hand you're allowed to develop as long as you think about the environment and cultural values and outstanding natural landscapes and 3 bulrushes in a paddock. All the RMA does is heavily tilt the playing field in favour of the environment at the expense of development and human welfare. So we're going to change that by separating out the functions of these 2 acts.
But a big part of that, though, is, and this is an unfortunate feature of modern drafting, is that you have every act now, or every bill now, has purpose clauses that courts are used to interpret, supposed to only when there's uncertainty. But politicians, and the greatest respect to your profession, but politicians don't rank the order when they put directly contradictory purposes of legislation, and the RMA is a classic example of that.
That's why we're separating them out. It's just not possible to have a whole lot of matters of national significance that you have to consider, including even the habitat of trout and salmon, which, as far as I understood, were an invasive species. With all due respect to the trout and salmon fishers out there, and to try to offset
big fish have their own lobby,
right. But to try to offset the needs, say, to take water for irrigation or to store water for electricity generation against these other matters. So, but we're going to presume that you'll be able to build infrastructure as of right, as long as you're within environmental limits. And we'll leave it up to regional councils to choose what those limits are rather than have them dictated by Wellington. So 2 clear acts, 2 acts with 2 distinct purposes, one to manage effects and the other to enable urban development and infrastructure. Just
take me through how one of the 10, what were you calling them, 10 core design features is realise efficiencies by requiring 1 regulatory plan per region, jointly prepared by regional and district councils. Most councils are dysfunctional. How on earth are you going to get not only Napier and Hastings, or let's look at we're in Wellington, Hutt City, Upper Hutt, Wellington, and Greater Wellington to work together to achieve this, or is this preempting local government reform?
Well, we think that form should follow function, and so
that's a yes.
So it does not preclude local government reform, but that's not the intention of what we're trying to do with this.
Then how on earth? I mean, here in Wellington, Tory whānau are struggling even to pass a long-term plan or a long-term budget. How on earth are you going to achieve that when you've got the overlay of a regional council? Which, if you
we're not going to have an overlay, Jordan. That's the purpose of it. So,
but are they going to have to agree? Like, who's going to ultimately be in charge?
They're going to have to agree, and this has been done many times before. The Auckland Council developed a unitary plan.
Because that's one council, though.
Well, so has the Tasman Nelson region. They operate as a unitary authority.
Yeah, unitary authority.
Gisborne.
Most of the country isn't under a unitary authority, though.
So what we're going to do is we're going to give them the benefits of that unitary authority approach. In other words, you have 1 plan per region, and that they'll be confined and guided by these new design principles.
And will the ultimate decision making be up to only those that are democratically accountable?
That's right. So once the plans are developed at a regional, for each region, with the input from cities and districts, then they will have to be voted on democratically. So by those councils.
The reason I ask is that obviously there's the, putting aside even the mana whenua and, we've just had the last few days an Auckland Council decision to appoint. They found a chief executive for Watercare, New Zealand's largest infrastructure provider outside of central government, and the unelected Māori statutory board didn't get their way, didn't get their chat that they wanted. With ratepayer money, have taken their own council to judicial review and managed to overturn it. Today in the news, so I'm not making this up. The Hastings District Council is seriously considering giving the kids, the youth council, the 16-year-old nerds with nothing better to do, those absolute freaks from high school. When I say that as a former Hastings District youth councillor,
I thought you were.
But I mean, how can you take these people seriously? Where they start giving unelected people, in this case kids, we're not serious enough, so we're going to invite people to trip over their umbilical cords and vote on rates.
Well, they sound like very unserious people. What we're going to do is design a system that actually confines what resource management does.
But my question is that are you going to have protections against councils giving decision-making power or importing in mechanisms that mean decisions are not made by people that are ultimately democratically accountable?
Well, the problem you've outlined is a serious one affects councils now. We want to make sure that the plans that are proposed are enduring and actually do enable infrastructure and development. What you've seen in a lot of places around New Zealand, and Wellington's a classic example, where their regional council has been overly zealous in proposing and implementing freshwater rules. And that's led to a real constraint on housing development, even to the extent that they've tried to prosecute one of their own councils. And people have legitimately bought homes in a subdivision in good faith on the basis that they built them in a wetland. So,
Simon, that's not a yes. But it is.
So these are design principles, and the devil in the detail, like how this is going to be delivered and operated, is up to the expert advisory group. Now, I know some of those people very well. I've been their shoulder to cry on resource management issues for some years now. While
I think I know one of them.
Right.
Yes.
Well,
He tends to do that.
And so I know they are deeply familiar with the problems, particularly with local government and decision making, and also absolutely committed to getting this right and making sure it endures. A lot of the final decisions about the legislation and the drafting instructions will be up to Minister Bishop, but we're relying on the expert group to take what I think are some pretty clear design principles and objectives and turn them into something that can be implemented quickly. And that's the point of confining resource management to fewer things, assuming one plan per region is a spatial plan that says, hey, here's where the people are going to live. We call that zoning. Here's where the industry is. We're going to draw a line around that. We're going to call that an industrial zone. Here's the things that link them up. Roads, bridges, water and wastewater utilities. And that's why we're proposing one plan per region, one spatial plan that shows where people are going to live in enabling zones. So you won't have to ask for permission if it says residential, that you won't have to go and get resource consents for the driveway or the 1 metre high retaining wall as you currently do. You'll be able to build residential property there as of right. And where it shows infrastructure corridors or existing infrastructure, if you operate a piece of infrastructure, whether it's a road or a bridge or a water treatment plant, you won't have to go and ask for permission to reconsent that thing. If you want to improve it, if you want to upgrade, you'll be able to do that as of right, as long as it's shown on a plan. At the moment, these things are shown on a plan, but then the entire planning system drives these applicants into a resource consent process and allows every Tom, Dick and Harry to object. And we're also going to sort that out.
One of the issues that frustrates me with and I think it's a big driver of our poor productivity, is that both councils and courts, in fairness, impose utterly stupid conditions on consents that do not recognise the cost of capital. The classic example is, anywhere in the country you drive and there's a $1 million piece of kit sitting on the side of the road because they're only allowed to operate 8 hours a day, which they need 3 hours to set up and 3 hours to close down, so they only get a few hours of work in, while that thing sits there all day or all night, whereas you go anywhere else in the world and they are just going hell for leather to get that thing done in the least possible time. Will this fix that problem around the costs of consent conditions being factored in?
Yeah, indeed. So we do recognise the cost. The Infrastructure Commission estimated that's about $1.3 billion per annum just to consent infrastructure projects.
And that's the cost of delay, is it?
Well, that includes a number of things, such as stacking up all the technical reports you need before you go to Environment Court. But we're going to presume that if you have infrastructure, that you should be able to operate it as a right. That includes construct, maintain, renew, and operate over the long term. We shouldn't have to go and get resource consents to do things like put in a culvert under the road. Now, a lot of the reasons that councils impose very restrictive operating hours is because they assume that people are going to be upset if they see lights or hear a machine at night. Now, there's something you can do. You can go around and door knock businesses and homes, and you can ask them for permission. And if you get permission, you can go ahead with the work. But at the moment, council doesn't really recognise that. They still put you through a resource consent process. And as a civil engineer and working on roading projects, I've experienced that myself. Having had largely positive feedback from residents, would you please come and do it quickly and get the hell out of the way so we can get back to living a normal life? Or the alternative being, it takes 3 times as long, we'll have 3 times as much disruption. You know what people will choose. We want the resource management system to enable that in the future.
So let's have the timeline. How long before I can build my 5-storey high chicken coop in St Heliers?
Well, in terms of the timeline before the legislation, we're going to have the policy decisions taken later this year, drafting instructions issued early next year, legislation in the House in the middle of next year. That's to meet the Prime Minister's target that he's committed to. And then we're going to pass it by July 2026 through all stages. 2 bills through all stages.
So a year-long parliamentary process. So that's at least 6 months in select committee.
We're going to have a full select committee process.
And passing it in an election year. That's not... when you compare that to the reforms of the 80s or 90s, that's pretty slow. You don't think that represents huge risk of the National Party backsliding or the government getting cold feet, or, dare I say it, another coalition partner seeing opportunities to water it down?
Well, it's a coalition commitment. My experience working with National and New Zealand First people in leadership roles is that they want to see Kiwis getting on and getting stuff built. The fast track legislation, for example, which is going through the House
which now. In fairness, there's been a bit of backsliding there. What was the purpose of that? To de-gunk the RMA. A lot of that gunk and slowness is as a result of special provisions around iwi participation. That's still there, and from our supporters' perspective, that's quite a concern because it wasn't what was on the tin when we elected, voters elected the new government.
So in all fairness to those who designed the legislation, proposed it and designed it, so that that would be Minister Jones and Minister Bishop, what they described as a fast track approvals process is much faster. It's going to be 6 months for the things that might otherwise have taken years, and it also brings all of the consenting for all the permissions you need into one place, so you don't have to go and get a separate wildlife permit from DOC. For example, you don't need a separate Crown Minerals permit. All the things you're going to need, including public works access, are going to be in one place.
We're nearly a year into this term. You're saying that this whole replacement to the RMA is 2 years away, or within this parliamentary term. So it's only going to be in place for, best case scenario, twice as long as it took to pass. Genuine question. This fast track is really concerned a lot of our people on the basis that it's spending a lot of political capital on something that's supposed to be only a temporary measure. And to be frank, just invites the very allegations from our opponents of special deals for special friends.
Well, let's assume that we're going to need a one-stop shop approvals process for complex projects, an enduring process. We've seen that whether it was a board of inquiry process that existed under the RMA or Parker's COVID Fast Track 19. We're going to need this. There's stuff that's more complex than your local council can look at, and we also don't want everything going off to the Environment Court.
So will Fast Track endure? Will it be sort of an overlay over the top of that stuff?
Well, I would assume that given that there's been hundreds of applications, the time it's going to take to get through them is going to require for it to endure for a little time. But
is there a sunset clause in it?
No, there isn't. And like I said, I think there's always going to be a place for complex projects that require multiple approvals, say for wildlife conservation access, working in the coast, all of these things, being assessed by a group of experts on a panel at one place at one time. And there will always be a place for iwi to have a voice in that as well, where it's set down very clearly in a treaty settlement. And I think that's the difference between
but it goes further than fast track goes further than that.
Well, it's set down in fast track, and we've certainly we've also established that as a legislative principle for the replacement system, which is we're going to uphold Treaty of Waitangi settlements and the Crown's obligations as far as necessary.
What do you mean the Crown's obligations over and above treaty settlements?
So there are some settlements which
is that code for special rights of consultation, or?
Well, there are some settlements, and there are some arrangements that DOC has with iwi through settlements, say where they get to have a say.
Okay, well,
let's just assume that is a property right that's been translated into legislation. So we're not going to relitigate those. And I've spoken to...
See, that's the next line. So I want to explore this, and I appreciate that you didn't. That I'm it's what the Nats don't want to talk about. So I'll give you a perfect example to go back to Hawke's Bay. The Hawke's Bay Regional Council to change one of their environmental plans. Only they can propose it. It is passed by the council and then goes. I think it's called the Hawke's Bay Environment Committee, but it is a creature of statute as a result of a treaty settlement, where in order for the plan to be changed, it must be passed by a 2/3 or a supermajority of a 50-50 council iwi appointment committee. Now that is the definition of co-governance, and it is a fudge that the Nats really don't want to engage on, because they're quite right, and it's, and even I would argue that we want to, as I'm a believer in supporter of the treaty settlement process, but thanks to Mr. Finlayson, that sort of full and final settlement with a check versus full and final settlement with some sort of ongoing special governing powers that we're not really talking about much with the public. How are you going to tackle
Jordan,
that issue?
I've been a negotiator on major business deals, investments, on contract disputes, and that's probably wouldn't have been my starting or finishing position if I was negotiating on behalf of the Crown. But that's where it's landed, and so we're not going to relitigate that. What we are going to do...
So there will be elements of co-governance around
I'm saying if they exist in a treaty settlement process, and I'm not familiar with that one specifically, but I am aware that iwi, various iwi have powers or rights that have been conferred through settlements. We're not going to mess with that. Frankly, they are a property right, or they are a right that they have attained through legislation that's been agreed. What we actually focus on is the things that iwi want to do that the Resource Management Act is stopping them doing. So when I've gone around the country and I've spoken to iwi leaders about these reforms, and I've tested some of these concepts on them, one of them said to me, "You know what, Simon, if you could help us, I've got 40 people working in resource management in my iwi organisation. 36 of them are tasked with looking at other people's resource consents. I've only got 4 working on my own, which are property developments, business developments, subdivisions, for example. They want to focus on their own development, their own economic aspirations, rather than be considered, essentially a form of government or council department tasked with doing resource consent processing." Now, I think if we give people the opportunity to have their say about environmental limits, like where are the places that are important, what is the water quality that's important to you, and we're not talking about everyone having a say in other people's consents, but when we set the environmental limits, once they're set, there shouldn't be any need for people who want to say replace a culvert under the road, build some water storage, to have to go back and relitigate these things with different iwi and hapu once they've been set in the plan.
No one would disagree with you with what you're saying there. Well, certainly no one that listens to that excellent Taxpayer Talk podcast would disagree with you there. But more and more, there are reports of what economists would call rent seeking, particularly in areas where the RMA has invited consideration of not just the scientific but the metaphysical. And the classic example is, of course, what's happening in water.
Yes.
This is the Te Mana o Te Wai, the mana of the water, where regional councils are tasked with figuring out, because the mana of the water can vary in different places, what is happening. And I every week when I'm on a fundraising trip, I get reports of people having to pay money in order for objections, often to do with the what most would call the metaphysical or the airy-fairy. That is a legitimate concern by many ACT supporters.
It is a genuine concern.
Will this tackle that?
Yeah. So let's just think about how.
Because it's separate to the.
There's two things there.
Yeah, the avenue it's got in there is where I've got a property right to be at the table, but then when councils are required to consider, the mana of the water and what was it in Auckland, that was in the proposed Auckland Unitary Plan. We called it the Taniwha tax. I can't remember but it literally included the metaphysical, no rights to appeal. This was what required you to go up to 17 iwi groups. It's a real anti-scientific direction that that this stuff's been going at?
Well,
Will this tackle that?
fortunately, Jordan, the ACT Party has two engineers in it, David Seymour and myself. So we're focused on the outcomes that you get through science and engineering. We want environmental limits to be set with reference to ecological values, to water quality values, to the amount of water that needs to stay in a river, so that trout, salmon, eels, and other species can survive and thrive. That doesn't require the application of a metaphysical or spiritual or cultural value. And I'll just come back to the point that iwi leaders have made to me. They do not want to be involved being taken for granted as a de facto government department or council department evaluating other people's resource consents. They would much rather that water quality is something that's dealt with up front through planning. But
I'm sorry, son.
That's
BS. The Ngāi representative at the LGNZ conference was specifically saying no, that they've set up their own consultancy company on advising on resource management consents, and will not give anyone the go ahead until you've gone and got a report from their own company. This is the very area at least some iwi want to go into.
Yeah. And so it's been pointed out to me that the changes we're proposing are going to largely remove, if not completely remove, the right to charge for and demand those kind of approvals. The Resource Management Act currently says that applicants have to have regard to or carry out a cultural impact assessment or the impact on culture and heritage. What we're proposing to do is to move those requirements as far as practical into other legislation, heritage being one of them. We have a Ministry of Arts, Culture and Heritage. We think they'd be much better placed to make assessments about heritage values, and if they really value them.
Now you're getting them back to work.
But if we really value them, if they really value something that's heritage, whether it's Kate Shepherd House or whether it's the Gordon Wilson Flats, then we think they should have the gumption to make a budget bid to their minister and see how far they get.
You cover the rent thing, and that's positive.
Yeah.
Do you think that the Nats are over the line about the secular issue, about ensuring that? Because look, I'm sorry, but and I know that I'll be criticised for even raising it, but there is a sort of quasi-religious element coming into a lot of this stuff. But, water being the most high-profile example.
Well, the ACT Party is founded on Enlightenment principles. We believe in
personal
freedom, private property rights.
Do you think the Nats are there yet?
And what we've managed to get in the coalition agreement with Nats.
Okay, we'll work on
a system to replace the Resource Management Act with a new system based on property rights, which is an Enlightenment value. So we think we're on the right track, and let's think about the values that we share. One of the reasons we have the Resource Management Act is because previous councils did things like build a wastewater treatment plant on the shellfish gathering beds at Mangere in the Auckland Harbour. Now, that didn't just disadvantage the Māori who lived in the village across the road. That polluted that environment for decades and generations to come, and it's only just been cleaned up now. Since that was put there in the 1960s. We wouldn't do that again.
Yeah, but you wouldn't do that on a scientific or social basis.
We wouldn't do that on a scientific basis, let alone a social basis now. So I think a lot of the concerns that iwi, Māori and other NGOs have expressed around this government's intentions around the environment are really misplaced. And they're unfortunate. They're not actually engaging with us in good faith when they say things like this government wants to kill nature and it's ecocide and all this kind of crap that I hear coming from the opposition benches. We are focused on delivering better environmental outcomes by allowing local councils to set environmental limits, and we're going to provide a methodology for them to do that. We're not saying what the limit must be, but they're going to have to choose the places that are special, not paint everything as special, and they're going to have a very clear pathway for infrastructure to be enabled in those places. That's something else I'm working on, a national policy statement for infrastructure, which we want to endure in the new system. It says, look, we need to build things like roads, bridges, telecommunications, electricity distribution, and so on. We shouldn't have to ask for permission as if it's going to be declined. We should assume we're going to build it, and the only thing really to manage then is the environmental effects.
Poor Chorus and Spark, they'll be laying off whole teams.
Well,
it is such a...
but better for the consumers,
absolutely,
right? Better for the consumers. And there's a simple way to do that. As a civil engineer, I've been involved in lots of developments, lots of activities that are in sensitive natural environments. You know what? The consent conditions for those are almost always cut and paste from the previous one, but they can take tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars to negotiate. What we're proposing to do here is actually codify the way we manage effects so that if it's a piece of infrastructure, you'll be enabled to build it through the enabling infrastructure piece of legislation, and then when it comes to managing effects, you go, well, look, I'm complying with the code of practice or the national standard for putting a culvert in a watercourse.
Just got I'm conscious of your time. I've just got 3 quick questions. 2 are on the substance, and 1 is political. The first is just around that urban intensification. I sort of slightly in jest call it the Epsom fudge. That of course, as libertarians love, do what you do on your land, except if it's an Epsom where it's absolutely essential. David can defend my right to have a say over what my neighbour can do.
People of Epsom appreciate how hard he's worked.
Yeah,
and all New Zealanders.
I know, and now as an Auckland homeowner with townhouses going in next door, even I can feel myself being pulled in that direction. However, where do you land on that? Because of course for the Nats, it was sort of an unusual situation where Megan Woods got Nicola Willis to sort of sign up to their thing that looked to be some sort of libertarian paradise build. 4 stories high, 3 stories high, 3 metres from the boundary, whatever act or more on the sort of NIMBY sort of side. It was all a bit confusing. But without, I wouldn't be one to be calling out hypocrisy or give you a ribbing for it. But where do you sort of land on that sort of area?
Well, here's what we know we need. We need to unlock land for housing, both in greenfields areas, those areas outside our cities. Now, in many cases, they're already zoned on a map, coloured in for future urban development. But councils are not releasing that land.
You guys haven't pulled the Metropolitan Urban Limit, though, which Labor never did, but at least in opposition said they were going to.
Well, we think there's a much simpler way around it. So look, if you want to develop your land, if you want to build a subdivision, if you want to do industrial property, if it's zoned, and in many cases, so when you look at
one of the big reasons for the shortages of land is that
let me explain what the Metropolitan Urban Limit does right now.
It says farmers.
It says up to the Metropolitan Urban Limit, which in Auckland is kind of like out around Westgate, Massey. You have the right to build. Like obviously it's zoned current, but beyond that, it's called future urban. In other words, it's shown on a plan that tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people are coming to live there, but you're not allowed to build there now. We're going to remove those kind of limitations So
you are removing it?
They're not going to be relevant because under the new system, you'll have the right to build on your own property. If it's zoned for urban, you won't have to wait.
It's the price differential. On this side of the fence, it's worth 3 times as much because I can do something with it, versus on that side of the fence, I can still own the land, but I can't do what I can on that side.
We're going to say you can. Because as long as it's zoned for future urban, then you should be allowed to develop it. Right? Whereas at the moment, it's zoned, it's coloured in, but then there's this hard line. So that's completely unnecessary. So we are going to resolve that. And it's not a fudge. We are going to resolve that. And the other thing is in the urban environment. And you're a townie, so not all of your. You said you live.
I'm married in Auckland. Right? Fair enough.
These are specific urban problems. I live in a place called Te Atatū Peninsula in West Auckland. We've been experiencing this densification for almost a decade now, and it was ramped up incredibly in the last 5 or 6 years. And there are a lot of negative effects to that. There's nowhere for people to park, and a lot of building construction going on. But actually, once these new homes are in and people are living peaceful lives in them, they're a fantastic improvement in the quality of life for so many people who otherwise couldn't have come to live in my suburb with access to the motorways and access to the shops.
This is the equity argument.
Right?
Yeah.
So what we want to do is make sure that zoning is highly enabling as far as practical. And ideally, and this is something that Minister Bishop announced, I think in the speech that he gave to Resource Management Law Conference on Friday, is that ideally we'd move to a system of standardised zoning where essentially instead of having bespoke zoning arrangements, for every street or almost or every suburb in a city,
pick from one like 10 categories or something.
Yeah, and so whether you're in Invercargill
this is SimCity now.
Yeah, well, Well, in many ways, we want
just colour code them and they'll get it. They'll know how it works.
And again, that comes back to this concept of, can we make the rule of law stronger so that if you live in a particular zone, you know what the rules are and you can just get on with commissioning your architect, commissioning your builder, and you don't have to go and ask for permission.
So my last question on the policy side is around the impacts on competition. So I think he may have contacted you because I suggested he did. A mid-sized donor, property developer in North Canterbury, had a property development has been sort of bringing progressively onto the market. He's not big scale, but that's his livelihood and his life and his pride. No problems at all until an iwi group, I've given it away which one though, unfortunately, has brought property to do housing developments 2 k's up the road, and everything's going up. It's all stopped. You cannot get the necessary sign off. Now, that is one example, but I hear that it is a theme. Will this tackle including, and I'm going to think that even in times of treaty settlement, how do you prevent powers or rights being used to deliberately stop competition?
Well, that sounds pretty egregious, what you described. We want...
I can give you other examples of that as well.
Yeah. And if that's occurring under the current system, then that is a glaring fault of the current system. When people have told us, actually, the resource contract's not that bad.
We know it's happening with the supermarkets, for example, but it's now happening in this area too.
Right. So under the new system, the replacement system, we want that only people directly affected, in other words, neighbours, get to object to something, and only on the basis that it exceeds a zoning allowance, for example. And so that people who live 2 blocks away, whether they're doing their own development or whether they think that they once saw a bat there or a bird there, they're worried about it, they won't have the opportunity to object as long as the property development, the activity, actually lives within the rules for that zone. So that's going to clear away a whole lot of niggle and noise and reduce the cost of getting things done. The fewer people you have to ask for permission, the more that strengthens your property
My question is, have minds been turned, and perhaps the answer is just no, to that issue as, and it's different for different iwi groups, and I'm not suggesting that all of them are nearly as blatant as the example I just gave, but have minds been turned to the problems of relating to competition law and taking actions motivated to stop competition or a competitor?
The thinking behind the legislative principles incorporates those concerns. So I've heard them from a number of different.
I thought you would have. Because that one I sent to you, but yes,
and I wouldn't be specific because that they might. Well, as soon as you start talking about cases and people who live down the road,
and also, yes, and that's one of the big problems is that it's difficult to get property people to speak out because they repeat players.
And look, like I said, I've been a shoulder to cry on now for 4 years in opposition, and more recently my role as Under-Secretary while we've developed these principles and got this through cabinet. And I just want to acknowledge all of the people who've brought their problems to me. I hope that what we've channeled into these legislative principles is an expression of what they want to see solve the problem. And I'm really hoping that during the select committee process they'll come along and say, look, we really appreciate that Simon listened, that Bish listened, and what we see here is what we want. Now,
listen to you. You sound like a constituency MP.
Now the proof's going to be in the pudding. But I was heartened at the Resource Management Law Conference. Like after Minister Bishop and I had spoken, he had to leave, but I stuck around and listened to a few more sessions. And at the lunch break, a woman came up to me and, in all fairness, I would describe, look, I lived in Titirangi in West Auckland for many years, so I would describe her as the kind of older woman you might see selling honey at the farmer's market on the weekend. And she took my arm and she said, thank you, you don't realise how important this is. This is what we've been asking for years and years. Well, it turned out she's a senior lawyer in a regulatory team at a big council. All they want is a pathway to build wastewater treatment plants, upgrade the pump stations, build the infrastructure so they can actually provide more service land for housing so people get on with building.
Yeah.
And she saw these reform principles as being enabling and heading that
In
direction.
fairness, though, I remember having something very similar happen when we won the Taniwha tax campaign in Auckland.
Yes.
There was mana whenua provisions
Yes.
that a general counsel of a very well-known listed company said that they'd read our report, thought it was fantastic, and thank goodness we won. I was thinking,
But where were they?
where were they?
Yeah.
And I mean, I think there is a degree of repeat player, but they had such a dominant position. It was just pusillanimous. It was just weak-kneed corporate New Zealand not wanting to run counter to the cultural direction.
And we have seen it's much easier for big corporates to simply pay for an engagement or pay to get some consent conditions through that they need to operate. And while in some cases it might make sense for them to engage with different iwi or hapu groups on particular things, particularly if it's a big,
they're
project.
acting, of course.
And when I worked at Auckland Council, I regularly presented to the Mana Whenua Forum on things like how to fix up these closed landfills. And in most cases, they were like, we really appreciate the work you're doing to stop all these contaminants getting into the environment and make sure the landfills don't wash away in a storm. And I think that's where we need to get back to this level of engagement. It's in a respectful way where we all agree on the environmental outcomes, the urban development outcomes, the job outcomes, the economic benefits, and then those are accepted. And then we don't have to be arguing from a position of from opposition to each other to developments. We get rid of this ability for people to object to other people's developments. They're kind of hiding behind environmental effects when actually they are competitors, and we get back to a place where we can build. We can develop, and Kiwis can look forward to better lives, better homes, better jobs.
My last question is political, and it's it relates to actually, put it another way. How do you see the reaction to this? Do you think it will be smooth sailing, or do you think your opponents will put up an existential fight?
Well, we've had some quite practical response. Say,
Greenpeace. I'm thinking Greenpeace today, for example, which were.
Before we get to Greenpeace, because they are not serious people, but from Labor, for example, recognise that some of the things that we want to do in terms of spatial planning and one plan per region were good ideas that
won't matter. That won't matter for the tribalists.
No, they were good ideas that we agreed on when David Parker proposed them. They're good ideas that we want to explore and bring through. But Greenpeace called the proposal to replace resource management with a system based on property rights some kind of dystopian nightmare. Well, I had to point out to them that property rights are actually guaranteed under the 1948 UN Declaration on Universal Human Rights. So there are some people who you're absolutely right, they're totally tribal. They will oppose anything the government does. They'll call it ecocide. They'll say we're killing nature. They are not serious people, and we're not going to engage with them if they are not serious people.
The perfect segue into why I wanted to raise it in the question is, why are we publicly funding so many of the quangos and organisations that will be the ones instructing people to get into the streets and march against this?
Well,
you mentioned the fishers. Fishing game,
yeah.
For the I'm not any good, so it's very sporting. But when I want to tow a lure around Lake Rotomar, I've got to pay Fishing Game. Fishing Game do not stand for anything I agree with. I'm supposed to pay my licence, and it's for fishing stock and the like. Instead, they piddle it up the wall, fighting against things like this, taking all sorts of judicial reviews of anything economic. Why on earth? I have to pay a special tax or special levy for them. But there's a number of quangos that are directly or indirectly taxpayer funded. Have you turned your mind at all to tackling some of these?
Well, I don't know if Fishing Game had anything to do with it, but I've really enjoyed smoked trout caught in Rotomar and Rotowedi over the years. Look, let's
go and stay with Prebs, maybe.
Right, let's assume they've got an important function in terms of natural environment. They've got some specialist knowledge. So,
but it's not. That would be fine if there was a prohibition on them using it for lobbying. But that's where a lot of that money goes.
Yeah,
it's an example of. Let's not get hung up on Fishing Game, but there are a number of quangos that get money from the government, or directly or indirectly from the Crown, for, it sounds like, environmental work, that more and more of it is spent on political advocacy,
Well,
that
I would
they don't have
expect,
to go out and
Jordan-
get donations.
Jordan, I would expect the Taxpayer Union to be diving deep into that and bringing that to my attention, the attention of the government, and you do great work in that regard. What I will say is that Ministry for Environment have been directed to stop funding the legal challenges. They were handing out money hand over fist under a previous government to all kinds of organisations that were able to get money and then go and challenge even government departments on the consents they might need for a road or a bridge or something like that. We've put a stop to that. That fund is no longer available, except to help people who are in really egregious situations where they need a bit of support to defend themselves. So we have taken that action. What I would say is that, just coming back to this example you gave of Fish and Game and lakes like Rotowiti, Taupo, for example, they are examples of where between the users, the people who own land around the lake, and their council,
Taupo works a bit differently.
Yeah, but they came to an agreement about environmental limits in terms of fertiliser and land management that were essentially voluntary, and they've been able to achieve really good improvements in water quality. Now, it's been a bit bumpy for Rotowiti lately, and there's been other things going on in terms of algal blooms and weed and water temperature. But let's assume that we all want the same outcome for the local environment, whether it's the bend in the river, the lake where we live on or fish on. And I think that, if we listen and we agree on the methodology to develop those limits, then we'll get them on board.
Simon, regular listeners or viewers will tell you that the Taxpayers Union podcast is not one where we piddle in the pocket of politicians, but I certainly do want to say that if you, and I've told Chris Bishop the same, if you can deliver what this the speech and announcements on Friday suggest, it is the equivalent of Ruth's Fiscal Responsibility Act. It is the equivalent of the deregulation of New Zealand and the unleashing of the economic potential in the 80s, the removal of import licences, etc. But for our generation. So for the Taxpayers Union, it doesn't get, this will be the biggest tax relief, albeit a regulatory tax in terms of the significance of my children's prosperity or all our kids and grandkids' prosperity. So we wish you every bit of success in getting this bill through Parliament and into place.
Thank you, Jordan. It's a huge challenge. We're up for it, and when I go back, hopefully released into the private sector as a civil engineer, I want to be able to use this system. So it's the thing I've come here to do.
And build stuff.
Thanks,
Thanks, Simon.
Thank you very much.